June 4th, 1952. Plaza de Mayo, Buenos Aires. Hundreds of thousands gathered to see their beloved Evita at Juan Perón's second inauguration. The woman who appeared was almost unrecognizable. Beneath her fur coat, a frame of plaster and wire held her upright. At 33, Eva Perón was sustained only by pain medication. The crowds waved and cheered, unaware their spiritual leader was dying. What happened in her final months would become one of the most controversial medical stories of the 20th century. The descent of Argentina's golden icon wasn't just about illness. It was about power, desperation, and how far those around her would go to keep the illusion alive. The girl who escaped the Pampas. To understand how devastating Eva's fall was, you have to understand how high she had climbed from. She wasn't born into power. She clawed her way toward it from the dust and poverty of rural Argentina. Maria Eva Duarte was born on May 7th, 1919, in the small town of Los Toldos on the Argentine Pampas. She was the youngest of 5 children, born to a relationship that was never formalized. Her father, Juan Duarte, maintained his legitimate family in another town while spending months each year with Eva's mother, Juana Ibarguren, and their children. When Eva's father died in a car accident when she was 6 years old, the rejection was complete. The legitimate family wouldn't even let Juana and her children attend the funeral properly. They stood outside, unwelcome. That humiliation, that sense of being unwanted by respectable society, would shape everything Eva became. The family moved to Junín, struggling financially, living on the margins. Eva grew up watching her mother work herself to exhaustion, watching her older siblings try to make something of themselves, despite the stigma of illegitimacy. And she decided that this life, this grinding poverty and social rejection, would not be her future. At 15 years old, in 1934, Eva left for Buenos Aires. The details of how she made that journey have been romanticized and disputed over the years. But what matters is this. A teenage girl from the provinces arrived in Argentina's capital with nothing but ambition and an absolute refusal to go back. She found work as a model first, then small roles in B-movies. The work was inconsistent, the pay was terrible, and the competition was fierce. But Eva had something that transcended conventional beauty. She had presence, she had determination, and she was willing to work harder than anyone else. Her real breakthrough came in radio. By the early 1940s, she had steady work as a radio actress, performing in soap operas and dramas. She wasn't a star, not yet, but she was making a living in Buenos Aires, which was more than most girls from Los Toldos ever achieved. She bleached her hair blonde. She cultivated a certain style. She was building herself into something new. And then, on January 22nd, 1944, at a charity event for earthquake victims at Luna Park Stadium, she met Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. He was 48 years old, twice her age, and one of the most powerful men in Argentina's military government. She was 24, a radio actress with provincial roots. By all conventional measures, they should have had nothing to say to each other. But something clicked that night. Juan Perón saw in Eva a woman who understood struggle, who connected with the working class in ways he couldn't, who had the charisma and media savvy that modern politics was beginning to demand. Eva saw in Perón a path to real power, to the kind of position where she could never be humiliated again. The next morning, Eva arrived at work in a limousine reserved for the War Ministry. Their relationship wasn't subtle, and it wasn't without consequences, when the actress became a force. In October 1945, rival military factions arrested Perón and briefly imprisoned him. It was meant to end his political career. Instead, it became his launch pad to the presidency. The coup against Perón came from officers who saw him as too friendly to Labour, too populist, too willing to upset the traditional power structures that had governed Argentina for generations. They locked him away and waited for his support to crumble. Eva rallied support while he was in prison. She worked with the labour unions, helping to organise the massive demonstration of October 17th that forced Perón's release. The exact extent of her role has been debated by historians, but what's certain is that by the time Perón walked free, Eva wasn't just his mistress anymore. She was his political partner. They married 9 days after his release. In the civil ceremony in Junín, Eva became Eva Perón. When Juan won the presidency in February 1946 with 54% of the vote, Eva became First Lady at 27 years old. And she didn't approach the role the way anyone expected. Traditional Argentine society thought a First Lady should be decorative and quiet, focusing on charity work and social events. The upper class, the old families with their established wealth and European pretensions, expected Eva to know her place. They saw her as an upstart, an illegitimate nobody who had slept her way to power. They whispered about her past as an actress, implying that her only talents were theatrical. Eva didn't care what they thought. She never had. She had spent her childhood being told she didn't belong, being reminded that illegitimate children didn't deserve the same respect as those born into proper families. The rejection had hardened her, taught her that the opinions of the elite meant nothing if you had the people's support. She took over labor relations, meeting with union leaders for hours, awarding generous wage increases, building political support for Perón among the working class. She didn't just sign documents and pose for photos. She sat in rooms with men who had spent their lives in factories and mines, and she listened to them. She understood their grievances because she had lived their struggles in different forms. She cut off government funding to the Sociedad de Beneficencia, the traditional charity organization run by aristocratic women who had snubbed her, who had made it clear that a woman of her background would never be welcome in their circles. And she created her own foundation instead. The Eva Perón Foundation became her power base. Funded by mandatory union contributions, business donations, and a substantial cut of the national lottery, it built thousands of hospitals, schools, orphanages, and homes for the elderly. Eva personally oversaw much of this work, often meeting with poor Argentines who came seeking help. The scale of the foundation's work was staggering. Between 1948 and 1952, it distributed food, clothing, and medicine to millions. It built entire neighborhoods, including a community called Evita City. It provided scholarships for students who never could have afforded education otherwise. It operated mobile medical clinics that reached rural areas that had never seen a doctor. But the foundation also operated without transparency. There were no public audits, no oversight boards. Eva controlled everything personally. Critics accused her of embezzlement, of using foundation money to fund her lavish wardrobe and jewelry collection. The accusations were probably unfair in some ways and accurate in others. The truth was that Eva saw no contradiction between building hospitals for the poor and wearing Dior gowns to state dinners. She would work 20 to 22 hours a day sometimes, ignoring Perón's requests that she take weekends off. People would line up to see her, to ask for assistance, to tell their stories. And Eva listened. She gave them money, found them housing, arranged medical care, provided what the government and traditional charities had always denied them. There are stories of her meeting with people until 3 or 4 in the morning, refusing to leave while anyone was still waiting. Of her rage when she encountered incompetence or delays in helping someone who needed it. Of her crying at the stories she heard, then composing herself and making sure solutions were found. To the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the working-class Argentines who had never had political power before. Eva was a saint. She was proof that someone who came from nothing could rise to everything. She spoke their language, she understood their struggles, and she fought for them with a ferocity that bordered on fanatical. To her critics, she was dangerous, authoritarian, using the foundation as a personal slush fund while she wore Dior gowns and dripped with jewels. The hypocrisy of a woman preaching to the poor while living in luxury wasn't lost on anyone. But Eva had learned something from her childhood years of poverty. Power and image were intertwined. The gowns, the jewels, the perfectly styled hair weren't about vanity. They were armor. They were proof that a girl from Los Toldos could stand on the world stage and belong there. In 1947, she embarked on what became known as the Rainbow Tour, visiting Spain, Italy, France, and Switzerland. She met with Francisco Franco and Pope Pius XII. She wore elaborate outfits that cost fortunes and gave speeches that mixed glamour with populist rhetoric. The European press didn't quite know what to make of this glamorous, outspoken Argentine First Lady. The tour began in Spain, where Franco rolled out the red carpet for the Argentine First Lady. She was greeted with massive crowds and elaborate ceremonies. The Spanish government awarded her the Order of Isabella the Catholic. For a woman who had grown up as an outsider in her own country, being honoured by European heads of state must have felt like vindication. In Italy, she met with Pope Pius XII in a private audience. She wore black, as protocol demanded. But the dress was couture, the jewellery magnificent. She presented herself as both humble and powerful, a contradiction she had perfected over years of navigating between the working class and the elite. In France and Switzerland, the reception was cooler. The European aristocracy and old money looked down on this South American upstart with her nouveau riche style and populist politics, but Eva had never needed their approval. The tour was about projecting Argentina's power and her own importance on the world stage. But back home, her popularity was undeniable. By 1951, the working-class Peronist base was clamoring for Eva to run for vice president. She was more popular than Perón in many quarters. The thought of actually having formal political power, of being vice president, seemed within reach. Eva had also been instrumental in achieving one of her most significant accomplishments, women's suffrage. In 1947, Argentina finally granted women the right to vote. Eva had lobbied for this tirelessly, using her influence and the Foundation's resources to push the legislation through. When the law passed, she formed the Female Peronist Party in 1949, creating an organized political force of women loyal to the movement. She understood that giving women political power wasn't just about rights. It was about building a base of support that would sustain Peronism for generations. The women who voted for the first time in 1951 did so largely for Juan Perón, thanks to Eva's organizing and outreach. And that's when her body started to fail her. The bleeding wouldn't stop. It started with fainting. On January 9th, 1950, Eva fainted in public. Officially, the story was appendicitis. She underwent surgery 3 days later, and the removed appendix was presented as the cause of her problems. But that wasn't the truth. During that surgery, doctors found advanced cervical cancer. They didn't tell Eva. On Juan Perón's orders, the diagnosis was withheld from her and from the public. Some historians believe Perón kept it quiet for political reasons. Eva's power and popularity were crucial to his presidency. Any sign of weakness might affect the upcoming 1951 election. Others think he genuinely wanted to protect her from the devastating news. Either way, Eva continued working, unaware of what was growing inside her. The fainting continued throughout 1951. The vaginal bleeding became profuse, impossible to hide from those close to her. She would be giving speeches and have to stop, her strength suddenly gone. In August 1951, during one of the massive rallies where the Peronist faithful gathered to demand she run for vice president, Eva addressed the crowds from the balcony of the Casa Rosada. She told them she needed time to think about the nomination. The truth was simpler and more brutal. She was too sick to campaign. On August 31st, 1951, Eva finally made her decision public. She would not run for vice president. She called it the renunciation, framing it as a personal sacrifice for the movement. But anyone paying attention could see she was becoming thinner, weaker, struggling to maintain the facade. In November 1951, Eva was told she needed surgery. A hysterectomy, they said, to stop the bleeding. What she didn't know was that an American cancer surgeon, Dr. George T. Pack, had been secretly brought to Argentina to perform the operation. On November 5th, Eva was taken into the operating room. The Argentine surgeon Ricardo Finocchietto, whom she trusted, was supposed to perform a routine procedure. But once she was under anesthesia, Dr. Pack took over. He found extensive cervical cancer that had already spread throughout her abdomen. He did what he could, removing her uterus and as much of the diseased tissue as possible. Before Eva woke up, Dr. Pack was on a plane back to New York. When she came out of anesthesia, they told her the bleeding problem had been corrected. They did not tell her she had cancer. They did not tell her the cancer had metastasized. They did not tell her she was dying. Eva went back to work, because that's what she did. The foundation needed her. The people needed her. And maybe, on some level, she knew that if she stopped moving, stopped working, stopped fighting, it would all be over. But the recovery from surgery was slower than expected. She didn't regain her strength. The pain didn't go away. And by early 1952, it was becoming harder and harder to hide how sick she really was. The body consumes itself. By spring 1952, Eva was experiencing symptoms she couldn't ignore. Persistent cough that left her breathless, chronic pain that radiated through her body, starting in her abdomen and spreading until there was no position, no medication, no moment of comfort. Weight loss that made her clothes hang loose, that turned her famous curves into sharp angles. The cancer had spread to her lungs and other organs. Every breath was becoming harder. Every movement sent waves of pain through her system. And still, she tried to work. She was receiving drug therapy and radiation treatment. The radiation burned her skin, left her nauseated and weak. In a medical first for Argentina, they tried chemotherapy, administering nitrogen mustard in a desperate attempt to slow the disease. The nitrogen mustard was a derivative of chemical weapons from World War I, repurposed to kill cancer cells. It also killed healthy cells, destroyed her immune system, made her violently ill. Nothing worked. The cancer was too advanced, too aggressive. It had been growing for years before anyone acknowledged it, and by the time treatment began, it was already too late. Eva became emaciated. By June 1952, she weighed only 79 pounds. Her face, once full and glowing in photographs, became gaunt. The bones of her skull visible beneath skin that seemed stretched too tight. Her iconic blonde hair required constant maintenance to hide how it was thinning from the chemotherapy and radiation. The makeup artists worked overtime to create the illusion of health when she had to appear in public, applying layers of foundation and powder to hide the greyish tint her skin had taken on. But the physical deterioration was only part of the story. Eva's behaviour was changing too. She exhibited increasing bouts of anxiety, agitation, emotional instability. She would rage against her political enemies with a viciousness that shocked even her closest allies. The woman who had always been passionate in her politics now seemed consumed by fury, unable to modulate her responses or control her temper. The pain medication she was taking might have contributed to the personality changes. She was on heavy doses of opiates, and the side effects included mood swings, paranoia, and difficulty thinking clearly. But there was also something deeper happening. Eva knew she was dying, even if no one would tell her explicitly. She could feel her body failing, and the terror of that, combined with the physical agony, was breaking down the iron control she had maintained for so many years. In her last major speech on May 1st, 1952, addressing the crowds from Plaza de Mayo, Eva was visibly frail but defiant. She had to be helped to the balcony. Her voice, once so strong and commanding, was weak and raspy. But she spoke with the same fire, telling the gathered masses that she would always be a rainbow of love between them and Perón. But she also spoke about her enemies with barely controlled fury, threatening those who opposed Peronism, speaking of violence and retribution in ways that made Juan Perón's advisors nervous. From her sickbed, she reportedly attempted to organize armed workers' militias. The woman who had built schools and hospitals was now talking about violence, about crushing opposition, about defending the movement by any means necessary. Juan Perón was watching his wife unravel. The doctors told him she was in constant, agonizing pain. The medications weren't enough anymore, and her increasingly erratic behavior was becoming dangerous, politically and socially. That's when the decision was made. A decision that would remain hidden for decades. The procedure never explained. In May or early June 1952, an American neurosurgeon arrived in Buenos Aires. His name was Dr. James Poppen, and he was an expert in a particular type of surgery, prefrontal lobotomy. At the time, lobotomy was considered a legitimate treatment for chronic pain from cancer. It was also used to manage what doctors called difficult behavior, particularly in patients who were agitated or aggressive. Dr. Poppen had experience with both applications. The medical team treating Eva included Dr. Riccardo Finocchietto and Dr. George Udvarhelyi, among others. Juan Perón had given them clear instructions. Make sure she doesn't suffer, and please try to calm her down. What happened next has been pieced together from medical records, travel logs, eyewitness accounts, and analysis of Eva's skull X-rays conducted years later. Eva was told she needed another procedure to help with the pain in her neck and spine. Dr. Finocchietto informed her that they would sever the nerve causing the problem. She trusted him. She agreed to the surgery. But what they actually performed was a prefrontal lobotomy. They drilled 2 small holes in her frontal bone and severed connections in her brain, destroying tissue in her frontal lobe. The procedure was intended to reduce her pain perception and, likely, to modify her behavior and personality. She was never told what they had actually done to her. After the surgery, Eva's behavior changed. She became quieter, more docile. She also stopped eating. The woman who had worked 20-hour days, who had fought with the ferocity of someone who had everything to prove, seemed to disappear behind her own eyes. But she had one more public appearance to make, one more performance for the Argentine people who loved her. The final parade, June 4th, 1952, Juan Perón's second inauguration. Eva insisted on being there, on riding in the open car beside her husband through the streets of Buenos Aires. The doctors were against it. She was too weak. The exposure to the elements could worsen her condition. Eva didn't care. The people needed to see her, and she needed to see them. So they constructed the frame of plaster and wire that would allow her to stand. They dressed her in the fur coat that would hide how skeletal she had become. They gave her the triple dose of pain medication that would get her through the parade. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets. They cheered for Evita, their saint, their champion. They saw what they wanted to see: their First Lady, elegant and strong, standing beside the president. They didn't see the wire cage holding her up. They didn't see the pain medication coursing through her system. They didn't see the woman who weighed less than 80 pounds, whose body was being consumed by cancer, and the treatments meant to fight it. The parade lasted hours. Eva smiled and waved. She performed her role perfectly, one last time. When she returned home, she took another 2 doses of medication and collapsed. That was her final public appearance. From then on, Eva Perón remained hidden from public view, confined to her bed in the presidential residence. The cancer continued its work. By mid-July, she was drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctors could do nothing more except manage her pain and wait. On July 26, 1952, at 8:25 p.m., Eva Perón's heart stopped. The 33-year-old First Lady of Argentina, spiritual leader of the nation, champion of the descamisados, died in her bed at the Unzuy Palace. Radio broadcasts across the country were interrupted immediately. The announcement went out. The wife of the president, spiritual leader of the nation, had passed away. Argentina went into mourning, and the mourning was genuine, overwhelming, a collective grief that brought the country to a standstill. 13 days of tears. The government declared an official period of mourning. All activities were suspended. Flags flew at half-mast across the nation, and the people came to say goodbye. Before Eva died, Juan Perón had made arrangements with Dr. Pedro Ara, a Spanish pathologist who specialized in embalming. Ara was considered one of the best in the world at his craft. Perón wanted Eva preserved perfectly, not just for burial, but for permanent display. She was to be Argentina's eternal saint, forever young, forever beautiful. Ara needed to begin his work within hours of death to achieve the preservation Perón wanted. As soon as Eva's heart stopped, he began the process. This wasn't ordinary embalming. Ara spent over a year working on Eva's body, replacing her blood with glycerin and other preservative chemicals, treating her skin and tissues to prevent any decomposition. While Ara prepared the body for initial viewing, Eva's hairstylist dyed her hair blonde one last time. Her manicurist painted her fingernails with clear polish. They dressed her in a white dress and laid her out for public viewing at the Ministry of Labour building, the place where she had met with workers and union leaders, where she had built her political base. The building itself held symbolic importance. This was where Eva had spent countless hours listening to the descamisados, where she had distributed aid, where she had wielded her unofficial but very real political power. Bringing her body here was a way of returning her to the people she had served. The lines to view her body stretched for blocks in multiple directions. Hundreds of thousands of people waited, some for an entire day, to pass by her coffin. They touched it. They kissed it. They wept. Some collapsed in grief and had to be carried away by medical personnel who had been stationed throughout the viewing area. The scenes were unprecedented. People fainted from standing too long in the heat. Mothers brought their children to touch the coffin, wanting them to remember this moment. Workers who had received help from the foundation came to thank her one last time. Women who had voted for the first time thanks to Eva's advocacy came to mourn the woman who had changed their lives. For 13 days, this continued. The government finally had to end the public viewing because the exposure was beginning to damage the corpse despite Ara's preservation efforts. But even 13 days wasn't enough for everyone who wanted to pay their respects. People were still lined up when the announcement came that the viewing had to stop. On August 9th, Eva's body was transferred to the Congress building for an additional day of viewing, this time for government officials and dignitaries. The next day, after a final mass, her coffin was placed on a gun carriage and pulled through the streets by CGT labor officials. The funeral procession included Juan Perón, his cabinet, Eva's family, representatives of the female Peronist party she had founded, workers, nurses, and students from the Eva Perón Foundation. Millions lined the streets. Eva Perón was given a state funeral, a privilege usually reserved for heads of state. She had never held any official government position, but to the people who mourned her, titles didn't matter. She had been their voice, their champion, their Evita. After the funeral, Dr. Ara continued his embalming work. It took over a year to complete the process. He replaced her blood with glycerin and other preservatives. He left her internal organs intact, which was unusual but necessary for the level of preservation Perón wanted. The plan was to build a monument larger than the Statue of Liberty, where Eva's embalmed body would be displayed permanently, a testament to her legacy, a shrine for the movement she had helped build. But that monument was never built, because 3 years later, in 1955, Juan Perón was overthrown by a military coup, and Eva's body became a political pawn in Argentina's bitter divisions. The body that wouldn't rest. After Perón was overthrown, the new military government saw Eva's preserved corpse as a symbol of everything they wanted to erase. Peronism was banned. Displaying images of Eva or Juan Perón became illegal, and her body, kept in the CGT building, became a problem. The military couldn't destroy it. Even anti-Peronists understood that making a martyr of her corpse would only strengthen the movement they were trying to suppress. So they decided to make it disappear. In 1955, Eva's body was secretly stolen from where it was being kept. For years, no one knew where it had gone. Rumors circulated. Some said it had been thrown into the river. Others claimed it was buried at sea. The truth was stranger. The body was taken to Italy and buried in a cemetery in Milan under a false name, Maria Maggi de Magistris. For 16 years, Eva Perón lay in an unmarked grave in a foreign country, far from the people who had loved her. The military's plan backfired spectacularly. Rather than erasing Eva's influence, hiding her body turned her into a legend. She became a symbol of resistance for groups fighting against military rule. The Montoneros, a guerrilla organization, even kidnapped and killed a former president, General Pedro Aramburu, demanding to know where Eva's body was hidden. In 1971, bowing to pressure and desperate to stabilize the country, the military government returned Eva's remains to her exiled widower. Juan Perón was living in Madrid. When he opened the coffin, he found that Dr. Ara's work had held up remarkably well. Eva's body was still preserved, almost exactly as it had been the day she died. Perón kept her body in his dining room. His third wife, Isabel Perón, would reportedly brush Eva's hair and speak to the corpse. It was macabre, surreal, a testament to how thoroughly Eva's image had been mythologized. When Juan Perón returned to Argentina and won the presidency again in 1973, he brought Eva's body back with him. He died in office in 1974, and Isabel, hoping to gain legitimacy by association with Eva, installed both bodies in a crypt in the presidential palace. 2 years later, another military coup overthrew Isabel. This time, the military showed more respect for Eva's remains. They were returned to the Duarte family, and in 1976, Eva Perón was finally buried in the family crypt at Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires. 24 years after her death, Eva Perón was finally laid to rest. Her tomb is now one of the most visited sites in Buenos Aires, always covered in flowers, left by people who still see her as a saint. What remains of Evita? Eva Perón has been dead for over 70 years, but her presence in Argentina has never faded. Her face appears on currency, giant murals of her adorn government buildings. Politicians still invoke her name, claiming her legacy. But what actually happened in those final months of her life adds layers of complexity to an already complicated story. The lobotomy, performed without her knowledge or consent, was kept secret for decades. It only came to light in the early 2000s when researchers began examining medical records and interviewing doctors who had been involved in her care. The question that haunts the story is, why? Was it purely for pain management, as some defenders claim? The medical literature of the 1950s did support lobotomy as a treatment for intractable cancer pain. Dr. Poppen had performed similar procedures on other terminal cancer patients, but the timing suggests other motives. Eva's increasingly inflammatory rhetoric, her attempts to organize armed militias, her emotional volatility, all of this made her dangerous politically. Juan Perón was walking a tightrope, trying to maintain power against military opposition and economic crisis. A first lady calling for violence and displaying erratic behavior could destabilize everything. Did Perón order the lobotomy to calm her down, to make her manageable in her final weeks? Did he convince himself it was for her own good, that reducing her pain and anxiety justified the procedure? Or was it simply doctors doing what they thought was best with the tools they had available in 1952? We'll never know for certain. Perón never publicly acknowledged the lobotomy. The doctors involved gave conflicting accounts or remained silent. The medical records that might have provided clarity have been lost or destroyed. What we do know is that Eva Perón spent her last weeks in a fog, robbed of the fierce intelligence and will that had defined her. The woman who had climbed from poverty to power, who had fought for the working class with relentless energy, who had refused to be quiet or obedient or anything other than exactly who she chose to be, ended her life with part of her brain destroyed by doctors acting on orders from her husband. The tragedy is multi-layered. There's the obvious tragedy of dying at 33 from a preventable disease, cervical cancer, which killed Eva and had also killed Juan Perón's first wife, is now largely preventable through screening and vaccination. Eva's death was medically unnecessary by modern standards. There's the tragedy of being kept in the dark about her diagnosis. Eva faced death without understanding what was happening to her, without the chance to make her own decisions about treatment and how she wanted to spend her final months. And there's the tragedy of the lobotomy, of having her personality and behavior altered in the name of pain relief and political stability, of ending her life as something less than the formidable woman she had been. But perhaps the most profound tragedy is how little any of it matters to Eva's legacy. The myths built around her, both positive and negative, have become more powerful than the actual woman ever was. She's been made into a saint by her supporters and a demon by her detractors, and neither version is entirely true. The real Eva Perón was a woman of immense ambition and genuine compassion, capable of both inspiring devotion and ruling through fear. She built hospitals and silenced opposition. She fought for workers' rights and lived in luxury. She was revolutionary and authoritarian, charismatic and calculating. She came from nothing and reached heights that should have been impossible for someone with her background. And when she died, she was mourned by millions who genuinely believed she had changed their lives for the better. The frame of wire and plaster that held her upright at that final parade was just the last in a series of structures that had supported her rise. Her marriage to Perón, the foundation, the carefully cultivated image of glamour and power. All of it was scaffolding for a woman who had learned early that image and reality were equally important, that how people saw you mattered as much as what you actually were. Eva Perón died at 8:25 p.m. on July 26, 1952. But Evita, the myth, the symbol, the legend, has never died. She lives on in the murals and the songs, in the political movements that claim her heritage, in the tourists who visit her tomb and leave flowers. She remains Argentina's most famous daughter, the woman who proved that someone from the Pampas could stand on the world stage. And nothing that happened in those final, painful months, no matter how controversial or tragic, can change the fact that for a brief, shining moment, Eva Perón made millions of people believe that change was possible. That someone who looked like them, who came from where they came from, could rise to power and fight for them. Whether that belief was justified, whether the Peronist movement ultimately helped or hurt Argentina, these are questions that Argentines are still debating. But the power of what Eva represented, the hope she embodied for those who had never had hope before, that was real. And it's why, more than 70 years after her death, we're still talking about a radio actress from Los Toldos who became a first lady, who built a political movement, who died far too young, and who has never really been laid to rest. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.